Hello to all. I'm here today in the Tier 8 classic Japanese cruiser, the Mogami. We're here today on the map Land of Fire. The mode is Domination, and we are in a pure Tier 8 match. Now the Mogami is one of the veterans of the game. The classical Japanese heavy cruiser. However, today we are of course playing her in her more popular form, the 155 Mogami, equipped with her 5 triple 155mm turrets. Now Mogami is a powerhouse from back in the good old days, so not quite as modern as some of the ships in this game, such as the Bayard, or even the Kid Asashio and Indomitable. Nevertheless, she has withstood the test of time to remain as a fairly powerful Japanese Tier 8. Now as a Japanese Tier 8, she has 39,000 health and no heal, pretty typical for cruisers of the tier. Decent hit point pool, but very thinly armored. She is mostly 25mm of extremity armor, aside from a very thin 30mm casemate strip and her belt armor, but otherwise she's relatively thinly armored, unlike the Miyoko, which comes before her at tier 7, which has that 41mm central, or actually I think it's 32mm, but that has that armored deck section. In addition, the Mogami is a rather large ship for a quote-unquote light cruiser. So you will find that she tends to take shells quite readily, especially through her large rear deck. Now as a Japanese cruiser, she has fairly standard Japanese characteristics that includes good concealment of 9.5 fully spec'd, and an excellent rudder shift, I believe of under about 5 seconds. Her range is fairly short at 15.7, but that's not too surprising for ships of this tier. Now in addition to her excellent concealment and rudder shift, she is a rather fast cruiser. Her top speed is about 35 knots. I have the speed flag equipped, so I'm going to actually exceed that in a straight line, but she is a fairly fast cruiser. You can see me pushing almost 36 knots in a straight line here, and just about peaking out here. And just minor adjustments to the rudder allow me to make some quick course changes. Now the 155 is of course a light cruiser gun, but more importantly, if you take IFHE, unlike the 152mm armed cruisers after the IFHE rework, the 155 is the only IFHE gun to reach 38mm of penetration, a significant number because you can use this 38mm of penetration to punish American battleships, of which there are 3 in this game. One of which is two of which are the Massachusetts on my side. Now with a 10-second reload, and 15 barrels, and the infamous Japanese HE Alpha of 2600, the Mogami is an absolute monster in terms of DPM, out DPMing even the Zao at tier 10. Now that of course does involve landing your shells from a safe position, but you can see her arcs are actually fairly lazy. Now not quite as lazy as say Cleveland shells, a comparable volume of fire at the tier. Cleveland of course has the 6.5 second reload but only 12 barrels. So in terms of volume of fire, it's somewhat comparable. However, those lazy arcing shells, at least relatively lazy as far as Japanese shells go, mean that you can make use of cover. Now the gun angles on the Mogami are fairly poor, but a good concealment allows you to get into stealthy positions rather easily. This combined with high speed and good rudder shift mean that she can be a rather slippery target. Here I'm making use of some cover at the edge of this map on Land of Fire to rain some fire onto these unsuspecting Massachusetts. And you can see pretty much raw HE damage, unlike most IFHE cruisers which would shatter on the middle deck. I punch right through. And even with IFHE halving my fire chance, still have a fairly respectable fire chance with Demolition Expert. Hipper pops up, and he's more of a priority than those Massachusetts. I already got my fire ticking anyway. And Hipper is not a battleship, so my shells will shred right through him. He's not a Russian heavy or anything, so I pretty much get almost no shatters. That must have been a turret or belt armor. Just maintaining a careful position, letting my Benson spot for me. Unfortunately, two of my allies here did die, or two of my allies are dead, one of which in the center, and one being the North Carolina over there. Hipper pops up a plane, but my air spotting, even when firing, is 9.9, which means I'm still at a fairly safe distance. As long as I get behind cover, it should be quite fine to keep railing fire onto this Massachusetts. Now, as I was starting to say, the excellent rudder shift and high speed of the Mogami do mean that you can actually play her open water with rudder shift module if you would prefer, but she's also quite fairly safe thanks to her good concealment in positions like this. Going to be briefly spotted here, so I'm just going to quickly slide back into cover. Pretty lazy shell arcs, as you can see. Back in cover now. I did just now launch a set of torpedoes, by the way. The Mogami has a pair of quads located in the stinger position, something you're very useful after playing Alba and Miyoko. These torpedoes have 10 kilometers of range and 17,000 alpha. Their stealth is unimpressive, but they are fairly fast and the range is good, and if you have idiotic enemies like this Hipper who stray a bit too close, they are a potent self-defense weapon. Scoring a flooding there, but more importantly 17,000 alpha is almost certainly going to cripple him to the point where I can quickly finish him off. And the enemies are pushing through, just occupying this position here on the flank. But now it's time for me to respond, I think. I'm in a fairly safe conservative position defending my carrier, but my carrier is fairly caught out by now. Not able to continue firing from this position, so I'm going to use my speed to get myself up. I don't have any enhanced propulsion or anything like that, so you have to be a bit careful. Fire my first salvo, and I get a fire quite easily onto that enemy Massachusetts. Looks like he's pushing down toward the cap and my carrier, so I'm actually going to drop some of the torps just to get in his way. Now the Mogami does have a fairly exposed citadel, so I do have to be careful. 10 of my 15 shells punching home there. Again, almost no shatters on that American armor. The Mogami IFHE is fairly specialized, finally getting shot at for the first time in this game. And my lack of armor means I'm going to take damage, but because of my relatively angled profile and decent position, I do fail to take a citadel, instead only taking over penetration damage. Now again, I have large size, and even with good rudder shift, my large size does mean that I can beach if I'm not careful. Massachusetts has now turned away from me, having dispatched my carrier. My fire is still burning, coming up at a fairly conservative amount of damage. You can notice I'm playing very, very cautiously from my current position. Reversing out, you can see reversing, not the best. Lose sight of my opponent. And my Kagero on the opposite cap does not appear to be making much of an effort. I'm gonna pop my fighter plane here, try and get some spotting, but looks like I'm just gonna body spot him really. Massachusetts secondary is going off, and you can see the large amount of broadside I'm required to give in order to shoot him. Just hoping for one more fire, gonna try and just engage. His secondary's light a fire. Light one in return. Some of his shells land home, but I'm just going to slip away with my fairly heavy firepower at this point. Back behind cover, he's spotted by the fire and my plane. Try to arc some shells, but not quite able to make it. Spotted by aircraft. Just for the briefest of moments. Oh, my plane orbits away, so unable to see him again. But you can see again, almost no shatters. my fire is almost out, but I have left my 9.5 kilometer spotting range. Do note that in the distance there is a Bayard charging at me, up to a very healthy 118,000 damage. Getting some pretty optimal situations where I get to farm that 38 millimeter plate. Playing on the flank in classical IGN fashion, using my good stealth to get the jump and first salvo onto the Bayard. Now he has reload booster and light caliber guns, but I am up a lot of HP and he is down a lot of HP. So I have no problem whatsoever just chunking the crap out of him. Now the problem here is that I cannot see him. I do know he's burning. Sadly though, I am spotted by gun bloom. But the end of the game is going to save me from having to suffer further. So sadly our first game was a feat, but a pretty easy 129,000 damage. Easily topping the scoreboard on my side. Sadly not able to finish any of the Massachusetts because I had to play extremely cautiously and was unable to continue railing on them. As you can see though, pretty much only HE damage and fire damage. Torpedoes of course putting in a good punch when applicable. Didn't have to use the AA defense, but the AA defense, like most Japanese cruisers, is kind of poor. Now before we continue, this is the port view, and as I had mentioned, the Mogami is fairly lightly armored, 25mm plate throughout. Now the IFHE changes did change her middle deck sections to actually be 27mm plate, and then there's that 30mm strake that I mentioned that can bounce up to 16mm shells. But overall fairly squishy, especially this rear stern section that's only 27 will tend to catch a lot of 16-inch or larger shells. This 27mm strength deck up here, or flight deck, is also not particularly powerful, but the IFHE changes, even though they nerfed the Mogami's incredible fire starting, did still leave her with 27mm plate, which is quite a bit heavier than a lot of light cruisers at the tier. If I take the Cleveland, for example, a classical light cruiser, this is a Montpelier, but it's basically a Cleveland. You will note that the Montpelier has the 27mm upper deck, but has 25mm sides, unlike the Mogami, which enjoys some somewhat heavy cruiser traits because of its heritage and ability to mount 203mm rifles. Now that aside, as I mentioned, 9.5km detection, 36.2 knots of speed top. And of course the 8 torpedoes per side into quadruple launchers of 10km range and 62 knots of speed. 155s of course have 2600 HE alpha, and with IFHE, fire flags, and demolition expert you get up to 8% fire chance on 15 barrels. AP on the other hand is a little bit faster at 925, so it's slightly flatter arcs. Well, actually it's the same, I'm kind of trolling, but only 3300 alpha. And no improved pen or improved penetration angles means that you basically will only use AP when you absolutely have to. And then as a Japanese cruiser, the Mogami does have some bulge, so she actually has 16% torpedo reduction, but honestly don't be catching torpedoes in cruisers, especially cruisers without heels. Now all the rest of the armor aside, besides that 30mm plate, there's nothing particularly special about the Mogami. She does in fact have a Japanese citadel, so you can see very large citadel space that is well above the waterline, stretching from mainly the midsection. So the citadel under her turrets is actually waterline, though you can still get citadel there, but in that midsection you can see it's quite raised, so if you get broadside, well, the citadel armor belt and the outer bulges is insufficient, with only about 140mm of belt armor in most sections. Thankfully, at least, these citadel spaces are 35 to 40mm of armor, so they can't get overmeshed by shells that just punch through and just touch them, but heavy caliber shells from cruisers and battleships will quite easily punch through. So the Mogami is a fairly squishy ship. You don't want to be taking damage, you want to be using that maneuverability and stealth and careful positioning around the map to kind of find a position where you can farm your way up. Captain Mai is a fairly standard Japanese heavy cruiser build. Priority target into expert marksman, into demolition expert, into concealment expert. Now as an IFHE cruiser, or light cruiser, she takes IFHE, so you take IFHE for 14th point. And then from there, Adrenaline Rush builds your basic 16 points. And then after that, you have 3 points that are optional. I choose to spend them on Last Stand and Expert Loader. Expert Loader is somewhat optional. This was mainly because I actually use this captain on some large cruisers sometimes. This used to be my IFHE Azuma captain. But anyway, Last Stand is actually quite good on the Mogami because her rudder and engine are fairly fragile, and so she does tend to lose them, especially when she takes torpedoes, heavy caliber battleship shells, or aerial attacks. Anyhow, with that said, we lost that game, so let's throw the Mogami back into the matchmaking queue, see if we can end up with a victory. So, fairly conservative in-cover play that last game. We were even tier, so like tier 8s only. So a fairly honest map with fairly large amounts of cover, but as a tier 8, you're going to get top and bottom tier games fairly frequently, so we'll see what results. We are fortunate enough to get another pure tier 8 game, so I guess the population is quite high right now at the moment. Another carrier, in this case it's a Shokaku, so I do have to be careful of basically all his armaments. My AA is fairly light. But again, still 2 American battleships which can bully, and then 3 German battleships which are a bit too heavily armored. 2 cruisers on the other side, the tier 8 premium Adago and a Cleveland, and then 4 destroyers. Now with 15 barrels and Japanese HE of 2600 alpha, the theoretical alpha damage against a destroyer is about 800 per barrel, so 800 by 15 puts you to roughly 12,000 HE alpha on an unsaturated target. So the Mogami is obviously quite fearsome against light targets like destroyers, where her HE completely penetrates them at every angle. So she does pack punch. The problem, of course, is in that she needs someone else to spot the destroyers for her, since, of course, she does not have a radar or anything as a Japanese cruiser. Now, as a Japanese cruiser, you can mount a hydroacoustic. It's a standard hydroacoustic, but of course, standard hydro is nothing. But quite honestly, because she's so thinly armored and not that suited to brawling, I tend to rarely mount hydro on her. I just take def A just to have a modicum of AA defense if I need it to shoot down rocket planes and such as these Shokaku rockets that are inbound. Somehow he's already lost 2 of them, which is an odd number. Typically you would lose 3, which makes me suspect that he's actually stock. He's probably stock using the 2x4 setup of A6M5C0s. So this Shokaku is not quite fully powered. Now this time we're on hotspot and it's a standard battle, and I spawned on the what is usually the A cap, which has a lot less cover. So probably not going to be doing as much stopping of my fast, light, heavy cruiser, shall we say, this time around. Instead, I'm probably going to be in the open. Thankfully, there is a North Carolina to shoot at, which is, as I mentioned, completely unarmored against my HE because I have that 38mm of penetration, so that 38mm middle deck, which normally protects him, is not going to do very much. Both of the American battleships are in fact on my side, along with an Adago. Torpedo tubes are up. I know the Kagero is close by. There's 4 destroyers, so we'll see if anyone's foolish enough to dive through. Just gonna pre-torp into that gap. That's a pretty popular destroyer position. And hold at range with my 9.5 kilometers of detection. Now, as I mentioned, I have fairly poor gun angles, so I have to show a large amount of broadside in order to fire. So I do have to be a bit careful. Looks like they're pushing in at another angle, so I'm gonna actually turn at this point. Able to burst down one of the planes with my AA sector, but don't expect to shoot down too many more. But anyway, I am turning, and I'm gonna lob off the other set of torpedoes. As you can see, the Stinger position, the angles are quite poor, not quite as poor as the Zhao's, but still fairly bad angles, and you can see my planes, or my AA is doing absolutely nothing against those Shellcaptor bombers, even though they might be stock. I'm gonna short one by just ramming into it, because Japanese torpedoes have fairly long arming distance. And I'm looking to find a victim. Looks like the Massachusetts is pushing away. He shot at me while I was briefly spotted by those aircraft. And my turrets on the front setup in the A, B, C, X, Y setup are still rotating. North Carolina pushing, Massachusetts fleeing. Just hovering at the back, I've declined to fire my guns so far, even at targets that are in range. Need to be very careful about how much broadside I show before I open up, so I do need to know where my targets are. Standard battle, of course, meaning that I don't have too many options. Oh, Oland is quite close to me, or actually there's a destroyer on this gap. North Carolina firing at me, and I'm pretty much full broadside to him, so I'm in danger. You can see, I lose engine and take a massive amount of damage. And I was briefly undetected, which means the destroyer slipped away out of my detection range. But my firing, of course, is going to bring my bloom up. Easy 4,000 on the first salvo. But you can see I'm only firing 3 of my rifles at the moment. Exposing broadside in order to bring all rifles to bear, but fairly risky. Remember my 27mm rear deck, which is where most of the shells are likely to land. Not able to ricochet. I do ricochet something off my 30mm casemate there. Now I would torp, but I have an Amagi in the way, but he's probably gonna die, I reckon. Looks like the North Carolina has taken his attention off me for now, so I'm just gonna slow down a little bit so I don't overkite. Put some fire into him from range. And you can see I have to give basically full broadside in order to bring all my rifles to bear. Moving very slowly, but he's not paying me too much heed. I think he might actually be reversing. Finally set a fire. And there's that Harakaze that was shadowing me, which caused me to take that initial 20,000 damage from the North Carolina. I'm gonna shoot some shells off at him. North Carolina's still burning quite steadily. Lose sight of that Harakaze. Adjust my angle slightly. Looks like the North Carolina is indeed reversing, but I'm just gonna chew him up with shells if he just keeps sitting there. You can see unless my shells hit turret armor or belt armor, I'm doing pure damage to him. Pure 155 HE at its finest. He's dueling one of my destroyers, or 2 of my destroyers actually, 2 gunboat destroyers, so he loses that quite handily. And now I have a destroyer problem. He's probably like here, looking for the Saipan, it's my suspicion. Now if I had Hydro, now would be a good time to pop it. I'm inside gun range, so he's within 914. Because the Harakaze has extremely short gun range. And lo and behold, there he is. And with a spotter, I can unleash hell. Now the Harakaze does have Akazuki guns, but with Kagero HP, you're not exactly going to be dueling with a Mogami. He does decide to open up, his engine's out, so I'm not aiming too far ahead. You can see torpedo bombers in the distance. Oh, I under-lead. He's using AP, and you can see I actually take fairly large amounts of damage. I'm just gonna pop my defensive fire because I want nothing to do with those torpedo bombers. Still not gonna allow me to kill planes that quickly. But bowing in is the answer here. Looks like the planes died without launching fighters because this guy's not very good. Saipan coming in for a KS. This guy's turning broadside to launch torps, quite obviously. Saipan trying to KS me. He did, of course, do all the spotting work, but what do I care? I did all the shooting. Not too much damage here. Just a destroyer, really. But I will easily mop up the Harakaze even with just my front guns, and because of my relatively high speed and comfortable clip of 36.2, I'm gonna just steam forward toward the Atago, Massachusetts, and Shokaku. Now, Japanese cruisers are not the best in pursuit, much more suited to kiting backwards and away, as with that North Carolina earlier. But you gotta do what you gotta do. My Z-23 being harassed, and it's a standard battle, so there is no real objective, just bowing in towards the rocket planes since this is patch 5.7, so the rocket changes have gone through. My Z-23 smoking. And I'm targeted by that Massachusetts. So expecting shells to arrive from the horizon any moment now. Helping out my destroyer, trimming those. I'm going to decline to fire until that fighter is completely gone, because that will give me a brief moment where I'm out of detection. And at that point I can make my turn. As I mentioned, need to show large amounts of broadside. It's a fighter headed toward me, making use of some natural cover to put on some farming. The classic Japanese cruiser gameplay. Turning in, just making sure that I can maintain fire on him. That fire is not in fact mine, but I don't really care about fires in this thing because I have IFHE. Shokaku making use of some natural cover to get a torpedo drop out on me. Pop my defensive fire, but really it's just there to mitigate the damage. Looks like the Massachusetts is reversing or altering his course. Take 2 torpedoes from the air. Again, my AA is not fantastic. He ducks out of my AA range. Back in, gonna sector him. That 16% torpedo bulge coming into play, I guess. But even with defensive fire active, only hitting 45, means I'm gonna have to dodge if I want to survive this. Let's see if I can get that good rudder shift to dodge those torpedoes. And indeed, easy enough. Problem is, of course, that I'm now beached, so his follow-up strike will kill me. Massachusetts healing. I'm probably gonna dodge rockets while I'm reversing, but there's nothing I can do about that. So I'm gonna keep my guns trained onto the Massachusetts in case I do get to fire. Oh, and there are the rockets as anticipated. Don't have defensive fire. Don't have a fighter plane. Just have my Massachusetts to hopefully trim some fighters on the way, but he's just gonna veer directly at me, or vector directly at me, and I'm gonna die. Such is the life of a Japanese cruiser versus aircraft. Or so I was saying, except this guy is not the brightest, so he has decided to spend his planes hitting the Massachusetts. Now I'm spotted, targeted by the Massa. Just outside of Massa's secondary range. Full broadside. Let's see if I can accelerate before his main battery comes into play with 10-second reload, or sub 10-second now because I have AR. Unfortunately, quite a few shells hitting plate, but you can see 2 quick salvos, and IFHE says, "You're gonna die." With that raw damage, he shoots HE for some reason, so instead of getting a full pen and dropping me down to dead, he just drops me down to 3k. At this point, Adrenaline Rush has Well, it should be bringing my reload down to sub 10 seconds. I guess it only shows the base reload there, that part of the screen. My win conditions are somewhat limited at this point. Don't have the HP to push in. I'm just gonna have to conservatively stay at the back and try and get some support fire off. I'll say this Kagero, but I can show off some of the longer range ballistics versus small targets, where my ballistics are not the best for sure. Can potentially die to one torpedo bomber at this point, so have to be careful. Combined A between myself and Massachusetts does seem to trim it down. There's a enemy Bayard somewhere in range. I do manage to land one shell on that destroyer. Not in range to attack the Shokaku. And my battleship is going to die. I have a defensive fire charge for 9 bombers, which is too many bombers to handle. I'm gonna have to show broadside here, dodge the bombs as best I can, but I have no expectation of surviving. You can kill me with just pens. And the Mogami without a raised citadel is quite vulnerable to bombers. My sector and defensive fire kill a grand total of 1 aircraft, 2 aircraft, so I am dead, and there she goes. Meanwhile, my Saipan is in the back, but you can't have everything be winners, so kind of showing off the classical Japanese scheme, not being able to win a game because, well, I can't push in the Mogami, I need them to push into me in order to be truly effective because of my lack of armor and a heal. Now if I were the Adago, which has heals and a bit more armor, I would have actually been able to push a little more aggressively there. But in that scenario, because I took that heavy battleship strike early on, which was unhealable from the North Carolina having been spotted out by that destroyer, and then I later took those 2 aerial torpedoes, well, that was all the HP I had left to work with in the game. And at that point, I have no choice but to basically try and force something because it's standard battle, so I don't have the win condition of caps, so at that point, I unfortunately did perish. So that was the Mogami over 2 games. As you can see, the firepower is still quite there, especially against American battleships. That raw HE damage is quite the kicker, but the lack of a heal does mean that when you compare her to her premium counterpart like the Adago, she is somewhat lacking. So if you look at the armor of the Adago, well, first off, the Adago is slightly stealthier even, 9.3, and then is even faster by a little bit, 37.3. In addition, she's slightly tankier for 40,000 hit points and 16% torpedo bulge again. But besides all of these things, she of course has a heal, which allows her to restore hit points. And her armored deck is quite a bit thicker. You can see unlike the 27mm deck of the Mogami, the Adago has a very powerful 41mm strength deck, which allows you to ricochet battleship shells when you angle properly. So she doesn't take nearly as many deck pens as the Mogami. The Miyoko, which we mentioned as well, at tier 7, that precedes the Mogami, also has this 32mm strength deck, which again deflects shells up to 16 inches in caliber, only folding to 457s and 460s. Anyhow, not going to have time to wait for the Mogami here, but I hope you enjoyed the brief 2 games. Sadly, you probably won't be able to win either of them. But with that said, that is the Mogami in 2020. Still fairly fearsome in terms of firepower, even with IFHE nerfing her fire chance. A little diminished by the presence of heavy armor and just the overall shifting of the metagame, but still a fearsome Japanese cruiser at tier 8. I hope you enjoyed the 2 kind of different contrasting playstyles of Mogami in cover and Mogami in the open, and I will catch you all later. Cheers.